Part 3, No Longer in a Future Heaven, Nationalism, Gender, and Race. In the concluding chapter, No Longer in a Future Heaven, Nationalism, Gender, and Race, from her 1995 book, Imperial Leather, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Colonial Context, Anne Mclintock takes Benedict Anderson to task for ignoring the way in which the nation is always gendered. She begins the chapter by recalling Anderson's warning against Gellner's dictum that nationalism invents nations, that Gellner tends to associate invention with falsity rather than with imagining and creation. She rehearses Anderson's view that nations, in his all too famous phrase, are imagined communities, in the sense that they are systems of cultural representation whereby people come to imagine a shared experience of identification with an extended community. From this, she proceeds to emphasize that as such, nations are not simply phantasmagoria of the mind, but are historical practices through which social difference is both invented and performed. But then crucially, she adds, nationalism becomes, as a result, radically constitutive of people's identities through social contests that are frequently violent and always gendered. Yet she concludes, if the invented nature of nationalism has found wide theoretical currency, explorations of the gendering of the national imaginary have been conspicuously paltry. Mclintock emphasizes that all nations depend on powerful constructions of gender. In her words, despite many nationalists' ideological investment in the idea of popular unity, nations have historically amounted to a sanctioned institutionalization of gender difference. And yet, she argues, with the notable exception of Frantz Fanon, male theorists have seldom felt moved to explore how nationalism is implicated in gender power. Mclintock quotes the path-breaking work of Neera Yuval Davis and Floya Anthias, who identify 5 major ways in which women have been implicated in nationalism. 1, as biological reproducers of the members of national collectivities. 2, as reproducers of the boundaries of national groups through restrictions on sexual or marital relations. 3, as active transmitters and producers of the national culture. 4, as symbolic signifiers of national difference. And 5, as active participants in national struggles. She goes on to sketch the contours of what she thinks the elaboration of a feminist theory of nationalism would entail. According to Mclintock, such a theory should be strategically fourfold. 1, investigating the gendered formation of sanctioned male theories. 2, bringing into historical visibility women's active cultural and political participation in national formations. 3, bringing nationalist institutions into critical relation with other social structures and institutions. And 4, at the same time paying scrupulous attention to the structures of racial, ethnic, and class power that continue to bedevil privileged forms of feminism. In the rest of the chapter, she tries to live up to this fourfold scholarly agenda by paying extended attention to the writings of Frantz Fanon in particular, before engaging in a critical feminist analysis of the racialized, class, and gender trajectories of the nationalisms of the Afrikaner community and the African National Congress in the South African context. Let us here, however, focus on the attention she pays to Benedict Anderson in the course of her account. In a preliminary section on the gendering of nation time, Mclintock quotes Baba, who, following Anderson, writes, nations like narratives lose time and only fully realize their horizons in the mind's eye. She goes on to emphasize that Baba and Anderson borrow here from Walter Benjamin's crucial insight into the temporal paradox of modernity. She adds, for Benjamin, a central feature of 19th century industrial capitalism was the use of archaic images to identify what was historically new about the nature of commodities. In Benjamin's insight, the mapping of progress depends on systematically inventing images of archaic time to identify what is historically new about enlightened national progress. Anderson can thus ask, supposing antiquity were, at a certain historical juncture, the necessary consequence of novelty? From this point, she goes on to argue, what is less often noticed, however, is that the temporal anomaly within nationalism, veering between nostalgia for the past and the impatient progressive sloughing off of the past, is typically resolved by figuring the contradiction in the representation of time as a natural division of gender. She therefore contends, women are represented as the atavistic and authentic body of national tradition, inert, backward-looking, and natural, embodying nationalism's conservative principle of continuity. Men, by contrast, represent the progressive agent of national modernity, forward-thrusting, potent, and historic, embodying nationalism's progress or revolutionary principle of discontinuity. Nationalism's anomalous relation to time is thus managed as a natural relation to gender. Mclintock concludes, national time is thus not only secularized, it is also domesticated. Social evolutionism and anthropology, she insists, gave to national politics a concept of natural time as familial. In the image of the family tree, evolutionary progress was represented as a series of anatomically distinct family types organized into a linear procession from the childhood of primitive races to the enlightened adulthood of European imperial nationalism. Like one of the family, race, ethnicity, and the paradox of the American family. In Mclintock's account, she emphasizes that the family trope is important for nationalism in at least two ways. First, it offers a natural figure for sanctioning national hierarchy within a putative organic unity of interests. Second, it offers a natural trope for figuring national time. Likewise, she contends that the metaphoric depiction of social hierarchy as natural and familial, the national family, the global family of nations, the colony as a family of Black children ruled over by a white father, depended on the prior naturalizing of the social subordination of women and children within the domestic sphere. Patricia Collins builds on these insights in her path-breaking 2001 article, Like One of the Family, Race, Ethnicity, and the Paradox of the American Family. The article explores how gendered family rhetoric contributes to understandings of race and US national identity. Collins illuminates, one, how intersecting social hierarchies of race and ethnicity foster racialized understandings of US national identity. Two, how the gendered rhetoric of the American family ideal naturalizes and normalizes social hierarchies. And three, how gendered family rhetoric fosters racialized constructions of US national identity as a large national family. Collins makes use of the French Marxist philosopher Etienne Balibar's distinction between external and internal racisms as two interrelated phenomena that appear across diverse societies. For Balibar and for Collins, external racisms are expressed through practices such as xenophobia, genocide, or so-called ethnic cleansing, and they aim to remove undesirable races from what is seen as privileged home space. In contrast, internal racisms occur when powerful racial groups subordinate less powerful racial groups within one society, typically because they need such groups to maintain their standard of living. Internal racisms, for their part, are expressed via practices such as colonialism, apartheid, and racial segregation, and they seek to include and control less powerful racial groups within what is seen as privileged home space. According to Collins, neither form typically appears by itself, and because they remain deeply intertwined, external and internal racisms often reinforce one another within the boundaries of pre-existing nation states. Collins goes on to pose the question, what happens when these dual racisms become integral to the founding moments of a nation state? She answers, national identity itself can become so compromised by such deeply embedded racial processes that it becomes difficult to conceive of national identity in terms other than racial. Such is the case of the United States. Collins traces a core racial triangle among white settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans, which became foundational to the new US nation state. According to Collins, the relationship among the first-class white citizen, the foreign Indian who stands outside citizenship, and the second-class Black citizen became fixed as essential ingredients for a fundamentally racialized American national identity. She adds that accomplishing this racialized national identity required reducing the myriad of ethnicities that characterize European, American, Indian, and African populations into three core racial categories. Collins goes on to argue that the relationships among these three racial groups were not only integral to the inception of US national identity and its codification in the founding of the nation state, but the racial triangle has repeatedly been reworked in response to the exigencies of subsequent historical periods. She contends that for existing and immigrant ethnic groups alike, the process of being or becoming American required jockeying for a position in relation to the racial reference points of white, native, and Black. Though she notes that the Latino population constitutes varying mixtures of all three racial categories, and thus from its inception has constituted an important challenge to the racial triangle described here. From here, Collins proceeds to introduce an analysis of how family rhetoric works to naturalize and normalize social practices that distribute wealth and poverty among US families. To this end, she insists social hierarchies of social class and gender rely on the rhetoric and practices associated with the American family ideal. At the same time, she continues, these hierarchies do not invoke family in the same way. On the one hand, class hierarchies rely heavily on exclusionary practices that seem designed to keep families separated from one another. Exclusionary practices appeal to notions of group purity. Reminiscent of external racisms, the goal is to remove the offending social group. in this case, poor and working class families, from competition for college admissions, desirable neighborhoods, and professional jobs seen as the property of more affluent, middle, and upper income American families. In contrast, gender hierarchies rely more heavily on practices designed to subordinate members who are permanently included within individual family units. According to Hill-Collins, gender hierarchies are reminiscent of the practices associated with internal racisms, insofar as they work with the theme of approximate difference, where it becomes important to maintain power differentials among individuals included in the same system. She insists, hierarchy becomes normalized because it is associated with seemingly natural family processes of family households, neighborhoods, schools, churches, recreational facilities, and the local shopping mall. In a word, the rhetoric and practices associated with the American family ideal naturalize and normalize racial hierarchy as well. Hill-Collins explains, in addition to the rhetoric provided by the American family ideal, practices concerning actual American families also work to naturalize and normalize racial hierarchy. The multiple meanings attached to the concept of home as a family household, and home as a neighborhood also speak to the significance of family in regulating the property relations that are so central to racial hierarchy. She continues, the history of race and class segregated housing that in turn constitutes the core identity of race and class segregated neighborhoods forms one important pillar of racial hierarchy in the United States. She contends, just as crafting a family from individuals from diverse racial, ethnic, religious, or class backgrounds is frowned upon, mixing different races within one neighborhood is discouraged. Hill-Collins goes on to add that the gendered nature of the American family ideal means that the production of racial hierarchy through racially segregated geographic and social space is also deeply gendered. The logic of racial segregation is imagined in terms of defending the family, in effect protecting private feminine entities from intruders. In sum, Hill-Collins concludes, if the US nation state is conceptualized as a large American national family understood through the rhetoric of the American family ideal, then this ideal may provide a template for assessing group placements within and contributions to US national well-being. She insists, within this logic, Native Americans, African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Chicanos become the domestic others. They become included within the body politic like one of the American family. In contrast, she contends, racial ethnic immigrants from Mexico, Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa become the foreign Blacks and Latino immigrants who become targets of exclusionary policies. Conclusion. Let us therefore conclude. In this lecture, we have explored the relationship between nationalism and racism. We began with an overview of how Frantz Fanon distinguishes between national and racial consciousness in his essay on national culture, included in his 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth. We then turned to examine Benedict Anderson's attempt to distinguish nationalism from racism in the chapter on patriotism and racism in his influential Imagined Communities. This before considering Homi Bhabha's dense but insightful criticism of Anderson's attempt to distinguish these two forms of politics and consciousness. We concluded with an attempt to further complexify the relationship between nationalism and racism by incorporating a gender analytic into our account through treatment of relevant chapters and articles by Mclintock and Patricia Hill-Collins. With that, we shall conclude.